This video is going to describe how natural selection acts on variation and eventually leads to evolution. So, let's start with a graph of height and frequency. Now, in a normal population, you would expect there to be what's called a normal distribution curve. In other words, with the mean, with most of the population being around the middle, with a few extremes, so some tall and some shorter. Now, imagine if there's an environmental change and it means that food lower down is more difficult to find. So, these taller ones will be fine because they can eat the food taller in the trees. However, the shorter individuals might find it very difficult to find some food, and therefore eventually they might die out. So if we redraw this graph with height and frequency, you would notice that the normal distribution curve shifts to the right. In other words, now the mean are all slightly taller. This is because the taller individuals have survived, they've reproduced, and passed on their tall genes to their offspring. The shorter individuals couldn't get food, so therefore they died. They didn't reproduce, and therefore their genes, their smaller genes, are lost. Now, let's draw another normal distribution curve. Okay. Now, imagine there was some drastic environmental change that actually affected the mean, okay, the average population. This could end up with the population becoming separated. This is because the two extremes are favoured for. And eventually this could lead to speciation. In other words, the formation of new species. This could be a species over time, and this could be a new species over time. This is because these two potential populations here will gradually become reproductively isolated from each other. In other words, no longer reproduce. There is no longer any gene flow between the two populations, so we end up with two different species. And this makes sense because, if you remember what the definition of a species is, it's a group of organisms that can reproduce to form fertile offspring. And these two populations will no longer be able to reproduce. So we have two new species. So, in the previous example, food was an example of a selective pressure. Now, selective pressures act on variation and can cause evolution. So let's have a look at a real-life example of evolution. The example we're going to look at is warfarin. Now, warfarin is a chemical that was used to poison rats around the 1950s. And when it was first used, it was quite effective, and most rats that ate it died within a few days. However, within about 10 years, most rats were resistant to warfarin and not affected by it. So how did this happen? So, in the population of rats, there is variation. Now, the majority of rats were being killed by the warfarin. However, there may have been a couple of individual rats that developed a random mutation that allowed them to be resistant to warfarin. In other words, they had developed a new allele for the gene. An allele is a different form of the same gene. So this meant the rats with this new allele, the new version of the gene, were able to survive. This meant when they survived they could reproduce, and this allele was passed on to their offspring. Those without the allele for resistance died. They didn't reproduce, and therefore their genes, their allele, was lost. And over time, the frequency of the resistant allele increased in the population, and you ended up with a load of resistant rats. So, to summarise: 1. In a population, there is variation. 2. Some are better adapted than others. Therefore, they survive. Therefore, they can reproduce, and they pass on their allele for that resistance gene to their offspring. Those without the allele die. Therefore, they don't reproduce, and therefore their genes, or their alleles, are lost. And eventually the frequency of the allele that enables adaptation has increased in the population. We can now say the rat population has evolved through natural selection. Now this theory of evolution by natural selection was first pioneered by Charles Darwin in the 1800s.